Fantastic introduction. And I'm so excited to be here and open this day for all of you and talk about knives at first. I swear we're going to get to leadership, but let's start with knives. This, what you can see here in the slide, is a butter knife. It's not sharp, but it's rounded and has a wide shape, so you can easily slice and spread butter. And this knife has to do with one of my favorite stories from working in a hybrid environment. This is from a previous role I had many years ago. I was working in a hybrid company. We had one office, but also a globally distributed team. And our CEO loved good food and useful tools. And at the intersection of that is where you find a butter knife. And our CEO decided to gift everyone a butter knife at the end of the year to thank them for their hard work. Now, as an aside, I'm still not entirely convinced that sending your employees a knife sends an appropriate message. But that aside, getting this knife was no problem for anyone who was in our office. Everyone received theirs well. They tried it out during lunch even. Good thing. But then there was everyone else in the other places across the world. Our people team had gift wrapped all the knives and mailed them out. But then customs didn't let the knife through. Some people had to pay extra fees to get theirs or pick it up somewhere in remote places. With others, the packages never arrived. So what was intended to be a nice gesture literally didn't reach everyone the same way because of the hybrid environment that we were in. This is leadership in a hybrid world. And today I want to talk to you about how to succeed when you, as a person and as a leader, can't be ubiquitous. I'll share with you some practical steps for leading successfully in hybrid environments and how to create space for teams to shine. And of course, I want to start with the basics. What is hybrid anyway? Now, here's the thing. I said at the beginning of this, you can't be ubiquitous, neither can I, unfortunately, but hybrid is it's a spectrum right now. There are no concise definitions, but I do think over the next years, as more and more companies move to this model and we see more nuances, we'll probably get to those. At the moment, I would define hybrid models as models, operational models for companies that do not require a full-time presence in an office. And the human presence is singular. Like, I'm here at my desk in Berlin. You are wherever you are around the world. And I'm very happy that you're here today. But none of us exist in two places at the same time. We can't be. So this also means that hybrid work at a philosophical level and with practical consequences that we'll get to, hybrid work only exists as the sum of remote and in-person experiences, but never actually in the moment. And I actually made a little chart to break this down for you. We're ultimately facing an overall of at least 6 different work modes. There's, for example, at the bottom left, the mode of working alone and in an office, like you just work by yourself. There's also on the top right, working together and remotely. For example, synchronous team meetings that a team is doing when they're distributed across different locations. And then there are a couple other modes that you can see here. And of course, there are intersections, like, for example, working in office, remote, and together, like in online and group meetings that take place in an office. The main takeaway I want you to get from this, aside from just this beautiful chart, is that hybrid work is a highly complex environment. And that also comes with a lot of consequences for leaders, and we'll get to those in a second. But why do companies actually choose those hybrid models? I think there are 3 crucial factors. The first one is, of course, talent acquisition and retention. Many companies believe that it enhances their ability to attract talent and retain talent. It increases their candidate pools, but also a lot of employees want this kind of work. Employee happiness is an important factor there. 63% of workers want this kind of hybrid model. There's also results as a driving factor. Companies hope that it leads to increased productivity. Catalyst research shows that access to remote work increases the chances of innovation by 63%. And at the same time, on the results side, there's also lower cost compared to having a fully co-located workforce in offices. Office space has not gotten cheap over the last years, well, probably over the last 2, but generally it's not cheap. And then there's, of course, as a third driver from organizations, that hybrid work really helps bridge the needs of different departments. If you think of, for example, sales and revenue organizations, many of these teams have historically relied very heavily on in-person work practices and collaboration as a and as an approach to their work, and as a really foundational thing for how they build teams and how they build effective teams. Whereas on the flip side, a lot of engineering departments have already adopted remote work over the last couple of years much more heavily, oftentimes because they had to, because it was the only way to grow talent and increase their hiring pools. And on the flip side, an organizational needs fully remote setups just aren't possible for all companies. Some healthcare workers, retail workers, smaller or more localized businesses, for example, just can't do this. And similarly, some organizations like sales or revenue teams just can't necessarily all work this way. And let's talk about the employee experience that this brings with it. So we've already seen this complexity, like these at least 6 different worlds that hybrid work means. And there are trade-offs to both like parts of hybrid work if you want to just look at remote versus in-office work. And of course, the advantages are one are the disadvantages of the other. So let's look at the office first. The office has a huge advantage when it comes to access. Access to, for example, relationship building with coworkers, bosses, but also access to unstructured social time, like interactions, the infamous water cooler, or the chat over a bagel in the coffee kitchen. Then there's also access to a good office setup, decent desks, probably ergonomical setups. Everything is there. There's probably a room where you can get a new keyboard if yours is broken. There's also access to development and career progression. Many networking events still take place again only in person. Or it's easier to find a mentor if you run into someone in the hallway. And access to learning from peers is another factor. But on the flip side, the office can also be a quite challenging environment for some folks. Many people, especially members of underrepresented groups in our industry, like people of color, are facing microaggressions in the office. Similarly, sexism and racism or homophobia can be quite rampant in a lot of places. Offices are also not accessible because they're often not designed with neurodiverse groups in mind. Like, for example, the noise, the light can be really distracting and hard to manage for people with neurodiverse brains, let alone then also be productive in this place. And a lot of offices just aren't accessible for people with disabilities or people with chronic illnesses. Or think of like foundational things that should be really basic human needs for everyone, like bathrooms that are often still gendered and are not accessible for people who are non-binary, for example. Let's, on the flip side, look a little bit at remote work, because remote work has one huge benefit, which is just cost. And I mean cost not just in the sense of, for example, lower rent because you don't need to live near a metro where the office space is, but also because you're saving time due to not having to commute. You have more flexibility. But on the flip side, there is also the issue of work-life boundaries with remote work. Like, the lines get blurrier if your desk is also in your living room. Distractions can occur if you also have to have your children at home because they're sick or because daycare is closed, as we've had a lot over the last couple of years. And a lot of remote workers also report higher productivity guilt because they don't have to commute and feel like they have to be extra productive compared to their coworkers who do. So it's a mixed environment overall. And the reality is there's also treatment of people. And I think that's a really big one because, and I'm going to show you one example from a quote from Angelica Lee, who's a professor of management and organizations at Duke University's Foggo School of Business. And she said, dealing with racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression is exhausting. And sometimes employees do need a break from just pushing through. Remote work can provide employees with that time and space to escape. So specifically, again, members of underrepresented groups in our industry may need to actually do remote work more just because working in an office is dangerous or at least damaging to them. This also means that, yes, both in-office and remote work have trade-offs. But the thing is, these trade-offs aren't the same for everyone. These are exacerbated between the vastly different preferences and needs between executives and employees in particular. 42% of executives report that they work from the office 3 or 4 days a week, compared to only 30% of non-executives, so that's 12% difference. The other main groups favoring in-office work are white employees and men, both groups who historically office spaces were designed for. Specifically, I'll just give you one example about women in the workplace to illustrate this. Many years ago, women's lack of access to higher education, like in the early 1900s, had basically excluded them from the practice of well-paid and high-status occupations. Cambridge University, for example, only fully validated degrees for women late in 1947, and even then after a lot of debate. Women were largely limited to low-paid and poor status occupations for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, or they earned less pay. Only in World War I, more than 1 million women joined the workforce in the UK. And until 1918, it was illegal in the UK for women to work in legal or civil service jobs. In 1919, there was a Sex Discrimination Removal Act, which was in 2010, so 89 years later, replaced with an Equality Act to protect against discrimination. To say who goes into the office and who has to make which trade-offs there is not the same for everyone. And who office spaces are designed for still isn't the same for everyone either. And there's an added factor which makes this whole thing a big, big leadership topic for us. And we're going to talk about how we tackle this later today. Because we still have this dynamic where while our organizations are working in a hybrid mode now, increasingly, the reward systems in our organizations haven't actually caught up to that. We still face a setup where the more visible your work is, the more it's being recognized. A 2015 study that's quite famous showed that remote workers at a Chinese travel agency were 15% more productive than their peers. But when it came to performance-based promotions, the in-house staff would still be favored, despite the remote workers outperforming them. And that's called proximity bias. Proximity meaning the physical proximity to influential people. For example, if you're offering in-person employees more exciting projects or professional development opportunities, like running networking events that only take place in person. Or you're a boss, you're in the office, you think, oh, I've just had a really long day, I have something to delegate to someone, but I really can't stand to get on another Zoom call. So I saw that Michael's in the office today, I'm just going to delegate this to him, that's so much easier. That's very understandable, first of all, but it's still proximity bias. And these proximity biases are what a lot of promotion, compensation, and performance review systems are still based on. And in a hybrid world, these skewed reward systems that bias towards proximity have consequences. It means that hybrid isn't the same hybrid for everyone, because as we've seen, not everyone has the same real choices that the model implies. It also means that hybrid work isn't an equalizer, but it actually exacerbates existing inequalities. Because if underrepresented groups are spending the least amount of time in the office, it can significantly limit their access to professional opportunities, from face time with the boss and that proximity to promotions as well as career mobility. And now this is a conference about leadership, so let's talk about what this means and challenges for us as leaders. First of all, we've already seen hybrid models have the potential to reveal and exacerbate existing inequities and inequalities. The complexity of hybrid that we've talked about also means there are many more variables to manage than if we had purely co-located or purely remote setup. Not all organizations are designed for this. Many organizations kind of haphazardly had to move to a hybrid or remote work model over the last couple of years, but they're still learning how to do this. Like a lot of organizational learning takes a lot of time. And if you think about how workplace evolution has worked, that's a really long process where we're talking decades. But now companies had to adopt these models within a quite short time, actually, and are still figuring out how to do this and how to do it well. But that also means that companies will be getting this wrong. And likely some of this learning will happen at the disadvantage of our employees. Another big factor there is that a lot of policies, benefits, and frameworks are often still designed for on-site work modes by default. It's either because those policies were already there and someone has to adapt them for remote workers, or because the policies just are thought of by someone who is working more from in an office, which again means a built-in bias. Another factor is the employee experience. I already mentioned that there is no one hybrid experience. There are multiple ones. And this also means there is greater variation in employee experience that we need to manage as leaders. Fear of missing out is very real in any organization. There's a Gallup survey that shows that 74% of employees have the feeling that they're missing out on company news in any environment due to the complexity that's again increased in a hybrid mode. And that also means that the communication complexity increases drastically. I've seen companies where we essentially got into an us versus them culture between in-office workers, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, between in-office workers as well as people who were working remotely compared to others. And these kinds of dynamics are really, really difficult to spot, but also to manage. And lastly, leadership roles are just different. There's much more effort involved. Knowledge and information are much harder to share consistently. So hybrid work can be great, but it is work. And this also means that hybrid leadership is fundamentally an issue of equity and inclusion. This is, of course, true fundamentally of any leadership, but as we've seen so far, a hybrid environment exacerbates the need for this work. And I want to talk about equity for a second, because you may have caught me. I almost said equality, and that happens because they sound so similar, but they're actually quite distinct. And the difference is important because equity is about opportunity. It's a constant ongoing effort, and it's about recognizing that everyone on our teams and organizations, everyone has individual needs for tools to succeed and grow. And leading with equity means empowering our employees with the tools that they need to be successful based on their individual needs. The difference between equity and equality, I just want to highlight based on an example. In a hybrid environment, equality would mean, for example, providing each person with the same resources, regardless of their needs. For example, giving everyone the same desk, regardless of where they're at or what their physical needs or limitations of their space are. Equity, however, as we've seen, it's about recognizing everyone's individual needs and then giving them the tools to succeed. So equity would mean, in this example, to give, for example, all employees a budget to get a desk of their choice. So they can get one that suits their needs best when it comes to physical needs, the space they're in, their design preferences, and whatever else is important to them. That's the difference between equity and equality. So equality, same for everyone, no matter what. Equity, individual needs, and then creating the space for those needs to be fulfilled. So hybrid leadership is fundamentally an issue of equity and inclusion. And I want to get into how to actually put this into practice. We've seen the hybrid environment is complex. We lead with equity and inclusion in mind. So how do we do this? And I have good news for you to begin with. The traits and goals of a good leader in a hybrid environment are no different from any other leader's goals. But the big point is that we need to adjust our tools and approaches to deliberately promote equity and adapt quickly. Promoting equity, we've seen it's an issue of equity and inclusion, and hybrid is not the same for all. The adapting quickly part is somewhat new. I mentioned earlier that organizations are still learning how to do hybrid and how to do it well. And that there is a great risk, and honestly, I've seen it, I'm sure you may have also seen it, there's a great risk that this learning for organizations about how to do hybrid happens at the disadvantage of their employees, which also means as leaders, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're learning quickly, we're helping our organizations learn quickly, and we do so ideally not at the disadvantage of our employees, or at least try our best to avoid that. So this is why promoting equity and adapting quickly are two guiding principles for the rest of this talk. And I want to share some goals that hybrid leadership kind of comes with, or that we keep in mind. The first part is creating a hybrid environment for our team and with our team. And we promote equity as part of that, and we'll talk about how we'll do this. We also unleash our team's potential to make sure that everyone can do their best work. Then, of course, we support visibility for everyone's work, making sure that other people know what our team is accomplishing, the impact that they're having. And lastly, we also change our organization for the better. And now you may look at these goals and think, hey, Lena, this is cool, but I've worked in other environments that were not hybrid before, and those were kind of similar goals that I had. And that's great. That's actually kind of the point of it. So I do think that the goals of a leader in a hybrid environment should not be fundamentally different from other leadership roles, but we need to use different tools, and we need to promote equity much more, and because it's uncharted territory, learn much faster than we ever did before. And here's the thing. Sorry, I'm just grappling with my slides. So here's the thing. I did work in hybrid environments myself for over 12 years, largely with companies that had one office or several offices, as well as a distributed workforce all across the globe. So a lot of the things that I'm going to share with you today are examples from my own work. But I also wanted to give you more and make this a richer experience. So I got input from a total of 12 other engineering leaders, from technical leaders like principal engineers to engineering managers, directors, as well as CEOs and co-founders. And the companies they're representing are a vast bandwidth, from very small 50 people startups to 5,000 employees to global megacorps with over 100,000 employees. And I have a couple of their examples and practices sprinkled throughout this talk. And I also have all of them. If you look on the bottom left of your screen in the slide, you can find a link there under bit.ly/hybrid-leadership. You can find many more examples and practices than I'm able to convey to you today. You can look those up later. And before I dive into all the details of what we're going to concrete steps that we're going to take, I want to share with you a couple principles that you can find at the bottom left of this slide, as well as on the other headline slides that are going to come over the next couple minutes. I do find working with principles really important. And I just realized that my slide order just got messed up, so you can find the principles in full screen over here. The guiding principles are something that I've used for a really long time in my own leadership work, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're usually reflective of my values, so of things that are important to me, and they guide my decisions, my behaviors, and my actions. I've usually shared those with my teams, and today I'm sharing them with you. These are the guiding principles that I put into creating this talk and into all the actions and steps that I'm sharing with you. I'm sharing those to make this visible, to be transparent with you, but also because I found that leading with principles is a really helpful way, because principles usually don't change very quickly. And I've operated a lot in high change, hyper growth environments where change is the business. But having principles to base decisions on and to guide your actions is really helpful, because they provide a bit of a through line and a long-term guidepost. And similarly, in hybrid leadership, I also had these principles, and these are mine. Not all of them may resonate with you, and that's totally fine. Take them, figure out which ones work, which ones don't, adapt them to your own needs, and use them. So the very first principle is to promote equity. We've talked about this. And the second one is to learn and adapt quickly. Those are the two biggest ones, honestly, that go into this talk. The third one is to manage our biases. You will likely, as a leader in a hybrid environment, you will likely have a preference. Either, for example, I used to work remotely most of the time in a hybrid environment, so that was definitely my bias. I made sure, or had a lot of conversations towards the goal of making sure that we were remote inclusive. And obviously that was my perspective. But I also had to make sure to incorporate and represent the perspectives of my office-based teammates as well. So manage your own biases, and we'll get back to that later again today. Then give me your team's autonomy. I do believe that teams need autonomy in order to do their best work. I also do believe that autonomous teams are much more cost effective than high context teams. And also it makes the work much more manageable than, again, like having huge context and high coordination efforts to manage from a team perspective. Creating clarity is another big one. Hybrid environments have by default much lower visibility than a completely remote or completely distributed team. So that also means clarity is a really important factor in leadership considerations. I also think clarity is really important to the point of equity, because being clear in expectations, in needs, in how we work together, for example, is a foundation for being equitable, for making sure that everyone has a chance to do their best work. So these are the 5 principles that go into this talk. You'll see them coming up quite often in practical examples, but now you know what's guided my thinking about this. And one last point I want to share here, and that's important, is I know that a lot of you who are here are actually in formal leadership roles like CTOs or VPs engineering, and that's really awesome. But I also want you to take away points here that are not just for you. because I believe in leadership at all levels. Like everyone can be a leader, no matter if it's your junior engineer or if it's someone with a formal title like an engineering manager. Leadership is about managing or handling ambiguity and handling and driving change. And that's something that everyone can do at all levels, which also means I do firmly believe that leading in a hybrid environment means encouraging everyone to contribute to building and creating great teams. So it's not just on anyone with a formal leadership role, but you can also share these practices with your teammates, with your engineers, and work with them to make this a great environment for everyone. So now that we've gone into the principles, let's talk about how to actually create a hybrid environment for our team. We've seen hybrid contains multitudes. There's not a singular experience. We need to create this with our teammates. So let's look at how to do this. And we'll just scroll too fast. The very first point and foundation of creating a great environment with our team is deeply understanding our teammates' experience. I mentioned earlier, we all have our biases, preferences, and like I'm not ubiquitous. I don't see everything. Neither do you, probably. And if you do, let me know how you do it. This also means that as leaders, our own lived experiences will differ from our teammates. We probably have more access, visibility, context, are in higher level meetings, and also have more power that comes with the role. So as a first step, actively seek out to learn your teammates' experiences. And actively manage your biases. One practical way that you can do this is when you plan your week at the beginning, like for example, Monday, sit down and ask yourself what needs to get done and who is going to do it. Then distribute any opportunities for work, anything you delegate across remote workers as well as in-office employees. And then halfway through the week, check in with yourself. Is everyone getting what they need to be successful? Have you heard from your remote employees? Or if you're in the office more, have you checked with your folks there? Another point is to utilize data to fully understand and address issues. And to me, that's one of the fundamental ones, because as a leader in a hybrid environment, I cannot see everything, which also means I need information to comprehend and to also make sure that my actions aren't just replicating my own biases and my own worldview. So one practical way that I used to do this is run employee surveys. Those are quite common, fortunately, at this point. But the survey that we ran also included locations. So usually in an anonymized way, so the data cannot be tracked back to a single employee, but locations in the sense, for example, office versus remote experience, or locations if you have a couple hubs with folks, making sure you understand what the experiences are like there. Review this data. Look at how the employee experiences differ. A lot of survey tools offer this kind of distinction. Another set of data that I can highly recommend looking at on a regular basis, so at least twice a year, is promotion data, compensation data. You can typically get this from your HR person, people partner. Look at promotion rates, compensation breakdown, role distributions, and look at factors like gender, race, but also location. Are the promotion rates higher, or are people getting promoted faster if they're based in an office or near an office? Look at that and then address the issues that you're coming up against. Another great point to building a a hybrid environment, here's the bias again, to building a great hybrid environment is to get to know your teammates and build really strong relationships with them. Diverse groups have diverse needs, and even between people working from an office versus people working remotely, you already have a little diversity. Ideally, you have more diversity than that. That would be great. But that also means you need to understand and recognize your teammates' needs. Because as we saw with equity, understanding everyone's individual needs is a foundation for equitable leadership. You can also help your teammates build relationship. Set up a habit or create a habit for people to actually talk with each other on the team. You can, for example, start meetings with icebreaker questions. Some teams really love that. Other teams hate that, and they instead solve the New York Times crossword puzzle on a weekly basis. You can also set up a space for deep technical discussions. For example, a monthly check-in for everyone who's working on the back end in your team. Whatever fits there, but make space for that. Create those kinds of recurring conversations. Another really crucial space for building relationships is during onboarding. I think hybrid onboarding or remote onboarding is one of the toughest experiences that you can have. And I think a lot of people saw that during the pandemic, because it can feel very lonely and you can easily feel like the outsider and like you're not fitting in. I made really good experiences with setting up an onboarding buddy. So having one person from the team dedicated to being the support person for the new joiner, meeting with them daily initially, working with them closely on a joint project, and making sure that they know what's going on and also understand how to be successful in this environment. Another good way is documentation, like making sure you have everything written down so people can look up and can find things on their own, because getting stuck alone at home while onboarding to a new team just sucks. I also recommend setting up group sessions to discuss team values, working styles, and preferences and roles across the group. So basically, be deliberate about onboarding and make it a good space for your new joiners as well as for your existing people on the team. Another step is to level the playing field in big as well as in small interactions. I find team level norms, it's the first bullet point here, and operating manuals a really good way to do that. You can also call them like team values, but essentially they're about establishing expectations for how a team is going to work together. And the goal there is to inspire trust, create clarity, and also being very explicit upfront and therefore unlocking performance of teams. Some examples of team level norms can be: we put everything in writing, or when we have informal meetings, you probably can't prohibit those entirely. Everyone documents the takeaways as well as the context so that it's visible to everyone regardless of their location. You can also define team core collaboration hours, like 4 hours in the day, for example, depending on your time zone distribution. Those 4 hours are the time when everyone is online and they do group work, pair programming, and sync meetings. You can also add dedicated focus time. So there are a lot of things that you can set explicitly as a team, and that's going to help a lot in terms of building trust, but also laying the foundations for people to work together well. Another really important point, I think, is documenting jargon, and that one is so easy to underestimate and such a big win when you do it well. By jargon, I mean, for example, acronyms, Slack emoji that are very specific to your culture, specific terms that just people who come in from the outside don't necessarily know, and things that are extremely familiar for everyone who's been there for a while. A company I used to work with had a really good practice there. We had a document. It was a simple spreadsheet, because everything's a simple spreadsheet. There was a simple spreadsheet where we documented all our acronyms, the special Slack emoji that people had created. And that was something that was shared during onboarding, I think even on the first day, and everyone in the company actively maintained it, which was awesome, because those things, of course, evolve. A culture evolves. It's not stagnant. When I joined this company, there was one Slack emoji that I stumbled across quite early on. It was a face, a headshot, and the tag in Slack was "that motivates me." And I didn't know what it meant. I thought it was cool, but also seemed a bit weird. And I asked a coworker about it, and they explained to me that it was something that was coined by a former employee. And this person had very often, when good things happen, said, "that motivates me." And it had become its own Slack emoji and was really heavily used. There was also, to complement it, the same headshot, but upside down for "that demotivates me." But this was a really good example of something that, like, where having the documentation was really beneficial, because it also meant it was very easy for new folks, including myself, to feel part of the group, to feel like I had an in. Another really big one for leveling the playing field is meeting equity. I do believe that if one person dials in or is remote in a meeting, everyone dials in. There's no meeting room meeting and then one person's on the computer in their home or anything like that, because that's not leveling the playing field. And that's also something that some companies have started making company practice at this point. So level the playing field also in your meetings. And manage the stressors of this environment. And I want to talk about 3 stressors in particular. The first one being chat tools. Chat tools are great. But I also do think they're a huge stress factor. There's constant noise. There's an expectation, implicit or explicit, of constant availability. It can make it really hard for people to feel like they can draw boundaries. A couple things you can do are, first of all, make it okay to not be available. Move stuff to team rooms instead of private DMs or small DM groups, so that there's visibility and that responsibilities can be shared. And third of all, you can also make chat tools more manageable by setting manageable defaults. Slack, for example, will by default just notify people of everything in all channels. And once you've joined a company and you've been asked to join 20 channels, it's basically immediately unmanageable. So you can either change this via policy within the Slack settings, or you can at least inform people about this in the onboarding guide and tell them to configure it to their liking. The second point is managing your energy levels, because thinking time can be really hard to get and it can be really exhausting. But thinking is also part of your job. A friend of mine who filled in this survey was saying, personally, I need to monitor and maintain my energy much more actively in a hybrid or distributed environment than I ever needed to before. I don't know if the barista in the local coffee shop knows that they're structural to my ability to feel engaged, but they are. So make sure that you get this kind of space. Make sure that you get thinking time. Make sure that you're actually able to be present remotely or in office for the people you're working with. And lastly, also create meaningful impact and development opportunities for everyone on your team. A couple ways you can do this is you can set up career coaching, where you pair team members with the right mentor, ideally someone with whom they can actually relate and who they can learn from. You can also mentor and coach your teammates yourself. And that's a really good effort. You can set up a mentoring program or start doing this on your own. The only piece I'd keep in mind here is that mentoring specifically is most effective if people work with someone who's like them. Because not everything that worked for you in your career may work for someone who's coming from a different background or has had different life experiences. So make sure that there's access to that. And also be a connector. For example, you're probably in a meeting with someone from a different department and you talk about a topic that may be interesting for someone in your team. Connect them, let them know about this. Or you hear about a new project that's coming up. Say, hey, this is actually something my team would be interested in. Can we work on this? So actively spot these kinds of opportunities and connect the people on your team or your team as a whole with them. And lastly, also help your teammates advocate for themselves and build networks. Because you see, a big part of people development, like as people leaders, is on us, as well as technical leaders, where mentoring is often part of the job. But we should never be the bottleneck to people's career development. And let's be real, not every manager is going to be around forever, and neither is every leader. So help people build the skill of advocating for themselves. One really good tool for this can be brag docs, and Julia Evans wrote a really good article about those. You can also help people by coaching them on how to manage up, how to manage their boss effectively, how to talk about the work they're doing. Give them these tools to actually be able to advocate for themselves and support their own career growth in this hybrid environment. And then, of course, unleash your team's potential. So we've so far created a hybrid environment. We helped our teams do good work. And now we also need to make sure that our teams have the clarity and understanding to know what's going on in the organization so they can work autonomously and be aligned with the impact that we're looking for them to have. And that's actually the first and biggest point here. Lead with results, don't lead with meetings. Set clear expectations and goals that are based on results. A couple of very practical tools you can use there are make annual development plans with each of your employees where you outline where they want to go in their career and what opportunities they're looking for. Do quarterly goal setting. You can use SMART goals, OKRs. I honestly don't care as long as you do it consistently. Then the framework doesn't really matter. So quarterly goal setting, both at the team level as well as with individuals. And in addition to that, of course, weekly check-ins, one-on-ones, as well as feedback as part of these one-on-ones. That's going to go a really long way with clarity. And then you've got metrics and success criteria in place, then you can also evaluate success based on those. And it also means you can evaluate success based on what people actually accomplished instead of, for example, how often they were in the office or how often they've been writing notes in a random Slack channel on any given day. And lastly, you can also adjust or should adjust your incentives accordingly. For example, in a previous company I worked with, I introduced the concept of what we call values champions, because we had company values, but we didn't want to just have them as sort of values on the wall that no one cared about. So we did a set up where basically every employee could nominate someone from the team to be a values champion, a person who's actually been living up to our values and with examples for how they did it. And these value champions were presented, I think, twice a month during our department meetings. And the person who nominated them usually got to do the presentation. And it was a big celebration of doing glue work. So doing the work that's often behind the scenes, that's often getting lost, and making those kinds of things visible. And that went a really long way to also building our culture and helping us be more visible as a team. Another big part of visibility is communication, of course, and creating clarity for everyone on our teams. And I love this call out to being a dolphin. That's from David Feeney, an emeritus professor of information management at Oxford. And the whole idea there is that dolphins can only take in very small amounts of air, so they have to resurface to the water surface around every 15 minutes. And be a dolphin in your communication as a hybrid leader. Pop your head up frequently, talk about little change, things that are new, things that are going on in the environment, instead of trying to sort of make a big splash all at once and then just disappear into the depths for a really long time. You can also you should tailor your content to your audience and your communication. So for example, one big question that people always will ask is like, how does something affect me? People always want to know. And think about things that are important to the people on your team. I used to work with a principal engineer who had a really good practice in that. They would weekly send an update email to all the more senior engineers in our organization. This email contained business context and also bridged the gap between technology and the business side for the engineers. This was really helpful context for people to see and hear what was going on outside of their direct scope of influence, and it also helped them adjust their work accordingly. So communicate in different ways and communicate to the things that your audiences need and communicate heterogeneously. There's this marketing rule of 7, just keep that in mind as a rule of thumb, where essentially communicate everything 7 times in 7 different channels, especially important again in hybrid environments. And those kinds of things include, vision, mission, strategy, context for what's going on, changes that are coming your way. Everything that you're seeing, remember, not everyone on your team will see the same way. So it's your job to communicate them. And feedback is a really crucial part of that as well. Set up open door policies. Ask for feedback with everything you do. When you put a document out, what feedback do people have for you? Ask people for feedback in one-on-ones. You can never ask for feedback enough. And don't wait to give feedback either. There's this rule that feedback shouldn't cross a weekend, which I think is quite good. Obviously, that sometimes may have to happen, but give your feedback early and timely, and then close the feedback loop. So follow up on feedback that people are giving to you, because that's going to go a long way in building trust. And of course, make it scale. So emphasize written collaboration. A lot of meetings can be documents. Like I used to run a strategy meeting with my team where I always prepared an outline of my thoughts, put a couple questions in that I wanted them to think about, and then everyone would write their thoughts already. So by the time we got into our meeting and our synchronous time, we already had shared context and were able to build on the things that we'd already discussed asynchronously. Those kinds of practices are really, really helpful for not just creating collective knowledge and getting everyone on the same page, but also for elevating your own role. Like you're using direction and guidance instead of having to micromanage. And the last part that I'm just going to quickly go through is how to make everyone's work visible. I already mentioned things like the values champs concept. And a big part of this work as hybrid leaders is pushing communication. One thing that I used to do is send weekly updates to my boss about what was going on, and also request weekly updates from my direct reports to make sure that everyone in our hybrid organization was on the same page about what was going on, the risks, and the projections for our work. Oh, my apologies. You can also make sure that you're actually finding visible work for your teams. I mentioned earlier being a connector. So finding bigger projects, higher impact work, and creating, therefore, the space for your team to shine. And you can praise in public. The value champions concept is one idea, but you can also just call out people's good work as a way to help other people learn from it. And lastly, of course, change your organization for the better. Hybrid is still new. We're learning as we go. We learn through feedback, we learn through strong relationships with our teammates and by understanding what they need. But ultimately, our job as leaders is also to change our organizations for the better. We need to change the reward systems. The reward systems that are based on proximity need to be based on impact in the future. So you have a kind of an area of influence there where you can support equity and learning in your organization. For example, by working with your employee resource groups or by advocating for equity in your organization. You can also give visibility to less visible work by sharing or share your learnings with other leaders and teams to make sure that they don't have to repeat the same mistakes that you may have made. You can also be an advocate in very small ways, like, for example, saying, hey, can we change the meeting time for this so that other people can join? These small acts can make a huge difference. So, as we've seen, successful leaders in hybrid environments promote equity and adapt quickly. We have guiding principles for hybrid leadership where we manage our biases, promote equity, give our teams autonomy, create clarity, and we learn and adapt quickly with our teams. Hybrid leadership is fundamentally an issue of equity and inclusion, and it's our duty as hybrid leaders to promote equity and adapt quickly with our teams and create equitable hybrid spaces where truly everyone can shine. Ask me any questions you have about hybrid leadership. I'm very much looking forward to discussing with you. I'm Lena Reinhardt. Thank you so much for having me.